Welcome, welcome everybody. This is the third top 10 list this week because it's Wednesday. Tonight's list will feature the top 10 teams that didn't win the Super Bowl. These top 10 lists are in honor of Hall of Fame / Super Bowl week. Some of them have directly to do with the Super Bowl, others do not, but it'll be a different one every night. Monday's top 10 was the top 10 Super Bowl games of all time. And Tuesday's top 10 was the top 10 players who have not yet been enshrined in Canton, Ohio's Pro Football Hall of Fame. But tonight, we detail the 10 best single-season teams that never won the Super Bowl. They didn't have to appear in the Super Bowl to crack the list. They just had to be single-season teams that were pretty damn good that didn't take home the Lombardi Trophy. Without further ado, it's time to get started. The number 10 team that never won the Super Bowl. The 1984 Miami Dolphins. They would finish regular season 14-2 and lose in the Super Bowl to the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl 19, 38-16. That year, if you could just describe Miami in one word, it was offense. They just put up points like crazy, averaging 32 per game, which was first in the NFL. They led the league in passing yardage, passing touchdowns, points scored, and also total yardage. On their way to a spot in Super Bowl 19 against the 49ers. They would lose the game 38-16, a game which after the first quarter they were not really in, and San Francisco, led by Joe Montana, pretty much just took the game over. The thing about the Miami Dolphins is if you look at them and you'd say, oh, the 14-2 team, Dan Marino has 0 through 48 touchdowns and broke the record by 12 touchdowns, you'd think, they should be in the top 5. I have a hard time putting them up there. The reason why they cracked list number 10 is, hell, they went 14-2 and lost the Super Bowl. Marino had, a lot of great players in that team, scored a lot of points, but here's the big problem with it. The biggest problem with putting up too high is because they were a pretty one-dimensional team. And it's funny because if you looked at the way that their defense played, you'd think, 7th in points allowed at 18.6 per game. Not too bad. And then you looked at the teams they played against, they really didn't play any high-powered offenses. And when they finally played against a decent one in the 49ers in the Super Bowl, absolutely shredded them. You look at some other teams. LA, the Raiders shredded them. The Chargers and Dan Fouts put up enough points on them to beat them. But the reason why the 84 Dolphins don't crack the list any higher is because of their defense. They weren't a team that, if Marino didn't play well, could win any other way. They certainly weren't going to run the football. They ranked 16th in running in yards per game and 17th in terms of rushing attempts. So it's not like they were a dedicated running team. They were 22nd against the run, 14th against the pass, and 19th in yardage defense. So they really was boom or bust, feast or famine with the way that team played. Marino went and played well, they won. If they didn't, then they didn't. And that caught up with them in the Super Bowl. The Dolphins of that era with Dan Marino really did not have any kind of defense or any kind of receiving core. And post-90, they really didn't have anything for him to throw to. So, to say Dan Marino's the reason they never was to blame for them not winning the Super Bowl, I think it's kind of preposterous. But, you need to give a quarterback, regardless how good he is, some talent around him. And other than the receivers he had, Dan Marino really did not have a lot of talent on that team. All right, moving on the list. The number 9 team that did not win the Super Bowl. The 1997 Green Bay Packers. Went 13-3 and lost Super Bowl 32 to John Elway's Denver Broncos. The consensus was in the locker room that the 1996 team that won the Super Bowl was not as good as the team in 97. But statistically, they weren't as good. They scored fewer points, gave up more, and they weren't as high ranked again in total defense. So honestly, you can make an argument that they weren't as good statistically, even though they might have emotionally felt like they were a better football team. I mean, you could probably make an argument to put them into the top 5, but the fact is, you could run on the 97 Packers. Like, if you look at the list of teams that they played that year, the team played 19 games, including playoffs. Over half of their opponents rushed for 100 yards. 5 of them topped 160, and 7 of them topped 140. So it's not really a winning formula, especially on defense. I mean, this isn't now in the modern game where, if you give up 140 rushing yards, it's not a big deal, just as long as you don't get burned through the air. Back then, teams were running the ball more, and you had to pride yourself and be able to stop the run, and the Packers really couldn't do that very effectively. In the Super Bowl against Denver, it cost them, because that was the game they got gashed on the ground for 179 and 3 touchdowns by Terrell Davis alone, 153 and 3 touchdowns himself. But a team record 179 yards allowed that year. It's not a very good sign from that defense. They didn't play particularly well when they had to. I mean, you have to put them up there because of their record and the fact Favre won the MVP the 3rd straight year with 38 touchdown passes. And the team in the Packers scored 2nd most points in the league at 26.4 per game, second only to Denver. But the fact is, you could move the ball against them on the ground. If you stayed patient, didn't make mistakes, you were going to be in the game against them. Eventually, Favre was going to make a mistake in quarterback. He always did. All right. Next up on my list, number 8, the 8th greatest team that never won the Super Bowl, the 1990 Buffalo Bills. I think the phrase, like a broken record, which is usually describes something that happens over and over and over again. If it originated anywhere, it originated in Buffalo, New York in the mid-90s. Because by that time, the Buffalo Bills had lost 4 straight Super Bowls. No team had ever done that. No team ever will do that. In fact, no team's ever made 4 straight Super Bowls to begin with. It's an incredible feat, but one that I think Buffalo feels drastically underappreciated for, and I can understand that. But if any of the teams that Buffalo had a chance to win the Super Bowl, it was the 1990 team. That might have been the best team that they ever had. That year, first in points scored at 26.8 per game. That was when the K-gun offense, the no-huddle offense that Marv Levy and Jim Kelly and them ran, really came to be a really, really effective way of moving the football, not just at the end of the game, but to start the game, they'd open in the no-huddle. And they would just drive right up the field. I mean, the Bills more or less stole the idea from the Bengals in the late 80s, but that's a different story, different time. The Bills, they would just run up the score. They would score a whole lot of points, and the defense on the sideline, they didn't care. They weren't going to get winded. They said, hey, let that puppy run. And they put up 35-40, and teams had to play a pretty damn good defense in the Buffalo Bills that ranked 6th in points allowed at 16.4 per game. So this team was more or less a very complete team. And the playoffs, unbelievable production out of that offense. They outscored their opponents in the playoffs 95-37. Yes, they scored 95 points in 2 playoff games prior to Super Bowl 25 against the Giants. What happened in that game was, against the New York Giants, the Giants just held the ball for so long. They set a Super Bowl record with time possession, and the Bills didn't get enough chances to score. They would lose that game 20-19. And I think emotion that kind of wore on that team so much that even though next year, they had a team that actually scored more points and was just as effective. I mean, they won 2 of their playoff games in convincing fashion. But the thing about it is they lost the Super Bowl to the Redskins, and then next year they got crushed. The year after that they got killed by Dallas, and the year after that they got killed by Dallas again. So I think it was a psychological thing losing that first Super Bowl to the New York Giants that really prevented them from winning any further ones down the road. But you look at the team, the players that Bills team had. Quarterback Jim Kelly, running back Thurman Thomas, wide receiver Andre Reed, who should be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And some other great players in the defense. The all-time leading sacker and Bruce Smith at defensive end, linebacker Cornelius Bennett, They were a very, very good team. They were. They're one of the most forgotten and underappreciated teams in league history. I mean, just because they didn't win a Super Bowl, we kind of looked down on them. But hey, they were pretty damn good. A lot of people won't give them enough credit for the way that they played because they didn't win a ring. But they're one of the best teams in league history because you get them any game outside the Super Bowl, and they beat just about every team in the early '90s you can ask for. Any of the teams in the league, they pretty much beat, and not only they beat very, very convincingly. The Bills, you could honestly make an argument to be higher on the list. NFL Network did their list of the top 10 teams that didn't win the Super Bowl, and they had the Bills at 3. I moved them down because you might not have scored a lot of points against Buffalo, but you could move the football. And as long as you didn't turn the ball over, you were going to put up some points. And again, keeping Jim Kelly and that offense on the sideline was pretty much the blueprint for how to beat them. And that's pretty much what the other 3 teams that beat the Bills later on down the road, the 2 Dallas squads and the Redskins team and the 3 Super Bowls after that, kind of utilized. Keep this offense on the bench. The ultimate turnovers, and you're going to beat them. Alright, that's the first 3 teams on my list. Coming up, 2 future teams following the early Bills would go on to lose to 2 of the NFL's upcoming dynasties. I'll talk about who the dynasties were and also what teams are that made my list. Next segment will be number 7 through 5. Stay tuned.